Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. Now, I hope you've been listening, and I hope it's really stimulated some reflection, some food for thought. And in the last episode, I talked about the issue of values, morals, and ethics. And the other day, someone actually asked me, and so I said, well, why do we need to know this sort of stuff? And I thought it was an interesting question. And an important one, and he wasn't being facetious. He was actually really wanting to explore my thoughts around this. And the thing is that irrespective of whatever it is that I'm doing in my life, there is a point where I make decisions, and those decisions are based on beliefs, attitudes, values, and different ideas and knowledge base that I have. Okay, so I'm doing this particular episode at the moment, or this series of episodes of values, morals, and ethics, because we've got to ask ourselves some very deep, pertinent questions at this time in history, where we are collectively seeing people make decisions about not just themselves, about the well-being of others. Now, some of those decisions are not based on the well-being of the community as a whole, but simply based on what's in my interest. Now, I'm not judging anybody here, but we need to understand very clearly what the ramifications are of making decisions of that nature, right? Because they involve a lot of things. They involve health, commerce, they involve politics, they involve relationships. One of the very, very sad things that I'm seeing currently is how some families are being split in two by differences of opinion, not necessarily differences of fact, which I could understand possibly. So we do need to be clear, and as I said before in previous episodes, that one of the things that I utilise in living my life is based on personal values, and those values need to work in relationship as well, but not just in my relationship with my partner, but also in my relationships with my children, my community. So it's a broader idea. Now, we also talk about morality as well, and then it gets even a little bit more complex when we start talking about ethics. Now, it shouldn't be that hard, but the problem is it isn't that straightforward either. So, first point, values guide my relationships with myself and or others. And usually it's an and others. Okay? So what system of morality do I have then from which to which I bring my values? And this is important because how do we get a moral system? Now, a lot of people who are religious will say, well, that's pretty clear cut. I'm a Catholic and my moral compass stems from my Catholic doctrine. A Muslim would say that this comes from the Quran. A Buddhist would refer to, the sacred scriptures of whatever school of Buddhism that this person adheres to. But what about a person who's secular? And this is where it gets interesting, because some time ago in the late 50s, there was a guy called Lawrence Kohlberg, and he got really interested in this whole issue about morality and moral development. which he took from a guy called Jean Piaget, who was a child development psychologist. Okay, so Lawrence Kohlberg basically adapted his developmental theory of morality from that of the developmental theory of Jean Piaget. And according to his theory, moral reasoning develops in 6 stages. And each of these stages are more adequate in responding to moral dilemmas than the one before. Okay, so it's essentially a knowledge hierarchy or a developmental, moral hierarchy. Okay. Now those 6 stages basically fit into 3 categories. And he talks about pre-conventional morality, conventional morality, and post-conventional morality. Now, this is important for all of us who are parents or teachers who work with children, because one of the things that's fundamentally critical is that as an adult, rearing, raising, teaching children, it really helps to have a clear understanding what that child, in a sense, brings to the table in their capacity to think. Right, and it's not all there straight away. It develops. So for example, stage 1, most kids are into obedience or punishment. That's their orientation. So this stage is about young children, and some adults are stuck in that place as well, where rules are seen as being fixed and absolute. So you either obey the rules or you don't. And obeying the rules is important because it's a way of avoiding punishment. So that's basically the centre of it. As the child develops, right, so does their capacity to reason morally. And in the second stage, it's more about self-interest. So as children grow older, they begin to see that other people have their own goals and preferences, and that often there's a bit of wiggle room. We can negotiate. And so this is where I talk a lot about kids being bush lawyers, because they've discovered this capacity to negotiate, which really gives them a big buzz and a thrill. And essentially a lot of the decisions at this point that a child makes is based on the principle, what's in it for me? So an older child might think about it in this way: if I do what mum and dad wants me to do, they'll reward me. Therefore, I'm going to do it. Okay? So the next stage is where the child now develops a more social conformity, right? And this is usually by the time they're teenagers. There's a sense of what good boys and nice girls do, and the emphasis is on living up to social expectations. This is where peer group stuff becomes critical. And as a parent, I really need to understand this stage very well, because rearing a teenager is a tough gig if you're not careful. And so the question arises, what are the social expectations, but not just in the family, but also in their peer group? And often at the moment, the peer group overrules the family. And this is crucial. So let's move on. Let's move forward a little bit in time. The individual's getting older, they're reaching adulthood. And at this stage, the core foundation of their moral thinking is about law and order. Adults at this stage tend to think about society as a whole when making any sort of judgment. The focus is on maintaining law and order by following the rules, doing one's duty, and respecting authority. Okay, now, if we tease this apart, we can see that there's probably going to be some, problems if we just stick and stay in this stage. Right? This doesn't work all the time. We can get ourselves into difficulties. The next stage, stage 5, as I become more developed in my thinking as an adult is what's called the social contract orientation. At this stage, people understand that there are differing opinions out there on what's right and wrong. And fundamentally, laws are just social contracts based on a majority decision and inevitably require compromise. Now, people in this phase, in this stage, sometimes disobey rules if they find them that they're inconsistent with their personal values. And they will also at this stage argue that certain laws will need to be changed if they're no longer working. And so we have this, situation currently with, the gay marriage bill that was, we needed a change in law, but not everybody agreed with this. We've got issues around how do we deal with public health? How do we make changes in the legal system that will accommodate that? So there is, the drug laws also come into this realm. People sometimes say, well, it's illegal, you shouldn't do it. But they will do other things that are illegal because it suits them. Okay. So stage 5, social contract. Stage 6 is now the sort of top of the pyramid for Kohlberg's moral development theory. And that he calls that the universal ethics orientation. Now, according to him, few people operate at this stage. Essentially, certainly not all the time, okay? And what he's talking about here is that it's based on abstract reasoning and the ability to put yourself into other people's shoes. Empathy, right? One of the core elements in human relationships, okay? So it's a process that for some of us takes a while to get to in our adulthood. Now, in this stage, people will have a principled conscience and it will follow universal ethical principles, regardless of what the official laws and rules are. Okay? So if I go back to 1932, Germany, and the Nazi Party is in charge, they created laws that were fundamentally completely immoral. And what it brought forth is a whole bunch of people who said, I'm not interested in the laws, I'm interested in what's moral. And dividing people according to race, religion, ethnicity is wrong. Now, for a lot of them, they unfortunately ended up dead because it's a risk to go against the state at that time. You were arrested, you were put into a concentration camp, and usually that was the end of the story. But at the same time, we had enough people who gathered together, irrespective of what the laws in Germany were, and decided to do something, and then with the aid of the international community, that regime was brought down to its knees. Now, the question that I sometimes have, if Hitler wasn't so busy invading everybody else, what would we have done as the rest of the world who didn't adhere to fascist principles? Now, we haven't escaped that type of thinking. We're in the midst of it where democracy, which is essentially a social contract orientation, which is stage 5, is under threat. And we need to consider what the consequences are of the decisions that I make in my activities within society and how I think about things. And this is where I come back down. If we're going to have a robust community that is psychologically and socially healthy and economically flexible enough and adaptable enough to give us longevity, then these issues of moral development need to be considered. It's not good enough when people